I can't think of anyone who better exemplifies the spirit and actually what we're trying to do in this speaker series than the speaker that we have with us today, Colin Kahl. I've known Colin for quite some time. I think we were thinking it was about 12 or 13 years. And he's come and guest lectured at the school and the center on several occasions. And the last time he was here talking about the topic that he's going to be talking about tonight, stability in Iraq and U.S. relations with Iraq, I was reflecting upon how many of our events over the past 5 or 6 years dealt with some aspect of Iraq. And frankly, most of them were incredibly depressing, as you could imagine. And the first time Colin came to talk to my class, I was looking at this, and I checked the date. It was April of '07. And a slide that Colin is going to show, and I hate to take away your thunder on this, but you can guess this is sort of a, you'll see the slide, the sort of incidents of violence broken down into various categories. And when Colin first gave a presentation to my class on Iraq was at the height, the worst point, where the highest sort of level of violent incidents were, which was in April and May of 2007. And I have to say, when he gave the presentation then, it seemed pretty much inconceivable that things would get better. Things only seem to be trending worse. And as you can see, in which Colin will lay out tonight, things are certainly still challenging, dangerous, violent, but things have improved by any sort of important measure. And I think that's a lot of what Colin is going to talk about tonight, both why that happened and how hopefully the progress can continue in the future. As I said, Colin is someone both in the world of ideas and in policy. I first met him when he was a Olin Fellow at Harvard. He then went to the University of Minnesota, where he was an international relations professor. During his time there, he got an international affairs fellowship with the Council for Foreign Relations, where he worked in the Defense Department and started working on these issues. He then he moved to Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and around the same time linked up with the Obama campaign for president and became their lead person on Iraq policy, right? And very soon after Obama went into office, he was named the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He just spent 3 hours with my class, and I think he probably has, my class would agree, the most difficult job on the planet. But we're very fortunate to have Colin here to explain this incredibly important issue and set of problems. So please join me in welcoming Colin Kahl to the Robert S. Strauss Center.
All right, I just got done speaking for 3 hours, so I'm going to put my coffee right there. Thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful Monday. I was about to say holiday, but that's because I now work in the federal government, and Columbus Day is actually a holiday back in Washington, D.C. So thanks for coming out on a Monday. Thanks to Frank, thanks to the Strauss Center for inviting me here, especially on such a beautiful weekend. My wife and I got to go out and enjoy the ACL yesterday. We had a great time. So I'm kind of a music junkie, so that was a wonderful opportunity for me. Austin's a great place. I've been here a number of times, although I think each of the times it's been more Middle Eastern in the sense of being kind of 100+ degrees. So the fact that it's in the 80s has been a welcome reprieve. Frank went a little bit into my background. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. The Middle East is actually, this is classic in terms of Washington, right? But the Middle East is actually defined in different ways in different organizations. But in my organization, it refers to the 14 countries and territories that stretch from Egypt through Iran. So Egypt, Israel, the Levant, Iraq, Iran, the Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula. So, you know, just the easy countries. I'm going to talk to you tonight about Iraq, where we are in Iraq, where we're going in Iraq. I hope to have lots of time for questions. There has not been as much attention paid to Iraq in the media and in public debate over the last couple of years. I think that's actually probably that's probably a byproduct of the fact that things have quieted down. Partly it's due to shifting attention towards the economy, towards Afghanistan and other issues. But just because kind of, us in general have not been paying as much attention to Iraq as we used to, this administration has been paying an extraordinary amount of attention to Iraq. So I want to give you a little bit of an inside picture into how we think about things and where we think we're going. This is an issue I've been working on for a long time. I started working on Iraq as an academic shortly after the war in 2004. It was a major issue of my research when I was at Georgetown University, which I will eventually return to. At the end of 2011, I just negotiated with Georgetown to have my own responsible drawdown back to academia coincide with our drawdown in Iraq, so I will be back to Georgetown at the end of next year. I was also the senior fellow and Iraq analyst at the Center for New American Security, which was a Washington think tank, so I was their kind of Iraq guy. Wrote some reports for them, and that was the same time that I was also working on the Obama campaign as the head of their Iraq experts group. So I'm actually less busy now than I was when I was doing all three of those jobs, believe it or not. I traveled to Iraq for kind of 3 extended research trips as an academic in some of the darkest days of the war, so I can speak to you a little bit about what that was like. And I've traveled there 11 times as a U.S. official since last February. So I go there about every 5 weeks on average. And I try to spend as much time as I can. It depends on who I'm traveling with. Sometimes I'm only there for 36 hours. Sometimes it's several days. But anyway, I was most recently in Iraq about 10 days ago, so my information is not all that stale yet. So I look forward to having a good conversation. I want to start the conversation really by marking or recognizing the milestone that the President marked when he gave his speech from the Oval Office on August 31st of this year. As you probably all know, on September 1st, the U.S. marked the change in our military mission in Iraq from combat and counterinsurgency operations to what the military calls stability operations, which successfully fulfilled the President's vision, which he laid out at Camp Lejeune in February of last year at the culmination of the administration's strategic review on Iraq. And it marked the end of what was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, and it's now called Operation New Dawn. For the United States, this change of mission really represents an important milestone in the transition from a predominantly military-led effort in Iraq to a civilian-led effort. This change of mission also marks a milestone in the full transition of responsibility for security to our Iraqi partners. Now, I say it's really the continuation of that transition as opposed to kind of the flipping of a light switch, because this transition to Iraqi responsibility has been something that's been picking up steam over the last several years and really kind of kicked into a new gear last January, on January 1st, 2009, when the U.S.-Iraq Security Agreement came into force. Some of you may remember from kind of back in 2008 during the campaign a lot of discussion about the so-called SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement. Well, we now call that the Security Agreement, and the Iraqis now call it the Withdrawal Agreement. But anyway, they all mean the same thing, SOFA, Security Agreement, Withdrawal Agreement. I'll call it the Security Agreement. The Security Agreement was actually negotiated by the previous administration. It was completed in November of 2008, and it did a number of things to include making U.S. forces that were in Iraq conduct their operations in a much different way. It got rid of unilateral operations. It required warrants for searches, changed the way we do detainee policies, a whole bunch of things like that. But it also put a couple of milestones on the calendar. One was that U.S. forces had to be out of Iraqi cities by the end of June of 2009. That's a milestone that we complied with and hand over primary security responsibility for the cities to the Iraqis last summer. We did that. And then the second milestone was the end of 2011, where remaining U.S. forces were supposed to be out of Iraq altogether. And so what President Obama did, I came in about 3 weeks after the inauguration to work on the strategic review. And we spent we spent 3 intensive weeks working on that. And it was in an effort to basically map the space in between, right? So you had this date on the calendar of June of 2009, where we're supposed to be out of the cities, and then the end of 2011, where U.S. forces were supposed to be out of the country, but how to kind of implement President Obama's vision of getting out of the war more responsibly than we got into the war. That's what he used to say during the campaign, but really trying to operationalize that, and to try to do it in a way that made sure that we were drawing down responsibly and in a way that our commanders in the field were comfortable with, but also in a way that was consistent with how the President spoke about it when he was a candidate. So this was kind of a tricky process. I'd be happy to talk to you about kind of how we did the did the gymnastics on that during the campaign. But what we came up with was a contour that called for a drawdown from where we started at about 144,000 forces when we took office to 50,000 forces by the end of August of this year. But we didn't tell General Odierno, the commander in Iraq at the time, how to get from here to there. We basically allowed him the flexibility to kind of do a non-linear drawdown so that you could have a relatively modest drawdown in 2009 as we were trying to consolidate some of the security gains from the previous couple years, and also freeze at a relatively high level for the Iraqi elections and immediately thereafter, and then have a more dramatic drawdown culminating in this 50,000 strong transitional force. So that's where we're at now. We've gone from 144K down to about 48, 49. It goes up and down on a daily basis, but it's right around 50,000, what we call the transitional force. And they're no longer doing combat and counterinsurgency operations as such, but doing a set of stability tasks that really focus on three activities, okay? The first activity is training, equipping, advising, and supporting the Iraqi security forces, okay? The second is continuing to partner with their special operations and counterterrorism forces on partnered targeted counterterrorism operations, principally against al-Qaeda in Iraq, some other extremists as well. And then third, the U.S. military continues to protect and enable the civilian side of U.S. operations. So providing movement and security for our provincial reconstruction teams, working with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq, and of course, protecting ourselves. You know, there have been a number of incidents since the change of mission where U.S. forces have actually been involved in firefights, and people are like, what's up with that, right? I thought we ended combat operations. Well, we are no longer in the lead in combat operations. Our mission is no longer defined as combat or as counterinsurgency. But Iraq is still a dangerous place, and there are still circumstances in which our forces may receive fire or may be advising and assisting Iraqis who come under fire and are called on to support them. And so they're still fighting in Iraq, and our forces are still sometimes involved in that fighting. But the fundamental mission that we have in Iraq has dramatically changed in line with the President's vision. You know, we've come down from 144 down to 50, and we're on the way down to completing the withdrawal by the end of 2011. But I think it's important to recognize that although our military presence and mission have changed, no one should interpret our troop drawdown as U.S. disengagement from Iraq. It's actually one of the trickiest issues that we face in Iraq, which is how to comply with our obligations under the security agreement and the President's vision of drawing down without creating the impression that we're abandoning the Iraqis, right? And in fact, our entire policy is arranged over kind of navigating that tension of leaving but not leaving, right? And so much of what I'm going to talk about today is really how we're trying to deal with that. The way that, you know, I've had the opportunity to travel with the Vice President, who's kind of the President's special envoy to Iraq on a number of occasions. Something that he likes to say all the time is that we're not disengaging from Iraq. The nature of our engagement is shifting. It's changing. It's evolving. It's moving from one that was predominantly a U.S. military focus to one that is now on the civilian dimensions. And it's assisted by the fact that there's a little recognized second agreement that went along with the security agreement called the Strategic Framework Agreement, which is a relatively short document. It's about a dozen pages or so, and it lays out the broad map or framework for a long-term strategic partnership with Iraq that focuses not just on the security side, but on education, science, culture, economics, the civilian piece of that. So that's become a major focus of our activities. So we actually see the drawdown of U.S. forces in compliance with the security agreement as the next natural step, not only in completing the transition of security responsibility to the Iraqis, but in transforming our relationship to Iraq as one between two equal sovereign countries and building the long-term partnership based on that foundation. So that's where I'm going to end up in the talk, but let me say a few things about where we are. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the security environment. The reduction of U.S. forces and the transition to stability operations has been enabled by sustained improvements in the security situation over the last 2 years. How many of you remember back in 2007 now in September, when General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker came back for several marathon sessions in front of the House and the Senate on Iraq. This was like, remember, this was shortly after, this was about 6 months after the surge. They come back to basically defend the decision to send more forces and to tell the Congress how much progress or lack thereof we'd been making. Do you all remember this? It was kind of high drama. All right. This was the Petraeus slide. All right. This is probably the most famous. Like when historians go back and look, PowerPoint didn't exist in the 60s, but when historians go back and look at the Iraq War, PowerPoint is going to play a role for better or ill. This is actually a pretty important historical slide. Okay. This starts in January 2004, not because everything was great before then, but that's when we started systematically collecting data. In much of 2003, our response to the insurgency was, what insurgency? That it was criminality, it was dead-enders, it wasn't organized, it wasn't something to worry about, it was something that the Iraqis would be able to handle. All right, it was really, by the end of 2003, that point of view became basically unsustainable, and we started to systematically track security incidents. So that's why this chart starts in January of 2004. Does anybody know what happens in this time frame when you suddenly get a big jump? Fallujah. Fallujah 1 is in this time frame right here. Okay. Fallujah 2 is in this time frame. If you were going to kind of periodize the conflict, this is the insurgency part of the conflict. Okay, where the vast majority of the conflict was organized around various types of Sunni insurgent groups that were fighting Americans. They were fighting the Iraqi government, the nascent Iraqi government, and they did it by trying to kill us, by trying to kill Iraqi security forces, and by trying to stoke sectarian violence inside Iraq in order to divide Iraqi society against its own government. All right. Well, what happens in this time frame? Anybody know? Samarra, the Samarra bombing. Okay. So the Samarra bombing happens. So we get the last big national election in Iraq. Okay, happens here. All right. The last time we had an election, it also took them 6 months to form a government, except that the country burned to the ground in that period. You had the confluence of a number of things coming together. Insurgent violence was bad. There were a lot of deaths of Iraqi civilians, inciting calls for vengeance, mobilization on the Shia side to back Shia militia groups, most notably the Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi army, Muqtada al-Sadr's group. You had the Samarra bombing, where al-Qaeda in Iraq blew up one of the holiest shrines for Shia Islam, which basically set in motion this kind of tit-for-tat cycle of retributive violence, whereby it was not uncommon for a bombing to happen in a Shia marketplace on a Tuesday with 50 or 60 civilians killed, and then for Shia militants to immediately turn around and execute 50 or 60 Sunni men and drop their bodies in landfills or on the sides of streets in Baghdad. So you had this power vacuum because of the government formation process, and you had this tit-for-tat retributive cycle of violence between Sunni insurgent groups on the one hand and Shia militia groups on the other hand. And so the country really, I mean, I was an academic before I was an administration official, okay? So at the time, you know how in 2003 there was kind of denial about whether there was an insurgency. In this period there was denial about whether there was a civil war, okay? There was a civil war, all right? And this was really when the country tipped into civil war. And so the attack levels peaked in late 2006 and early 2007 and stayed very high through this period, all right? By the way, these are incidents, okay? Numbers of IEDs, numbers of rocket attacks, numbers of gunfire incidents, things like that. But if you had another graph up here that mapped civilian casualties, it would basically be the same arc, all right? And so in this period, it was not uncommon to see 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 civilians being killed a month in Iraq, all right? It was not uncommon to see 1,500 attacks in a week. All right, sometimes much more than that. All right, so things were very bad. These were the darkest days of the Iraq War. This is the period, okay, of the surge and the Sunni awakening in here. Attacks start coming down. They've come down dramatically by the end of 2007. They come down even further in 2008. And then from January of 2009, when the security agreement comes into play and the Obama administration comes into office, that's where we're at. Okay, pretty flat. All right. But what's interesting in that is that it's not like things have been static in that period. We've withdrawn almost 100,000 forces in that period. We've handed over security responsibility to the Iraqi security forces in that period. And we fundamentally changed our mission in that period. And yet, security trends have stayed basically relatively constant at the lowest levels of the war, right? You know, a lot of people used to joke a couple of years ago that, you know, we'll stand down when the Iraqis stand up. I think this is probably the best indication that the Iraqis have stood up, all right? And that they are in much better place, still with our assistance, to provide for their own security than was the case a couple of years ago. That said, you know, because Al-Qaeda in Iraq continues to wage periodic high-profile attacks, every several weeks there's a bombing, a couple dozen people are killed against civilian targets, and the attacks themselves, by the way, are designed to create the impression that the government's not in charge, the Iraqi security forces aren't capable, that we're being driven out of the country, that nobody is safe. Because of that information environment, and because you do get these attacks every several weeks, the kind of change in the security environment is sometimes difficult to appreciate. Because the only time you ever hear about Iraq is when you pick up you know, the Dallas Morning News or the New York Times or something every couple of weeks and there's a bombing. And that's the only time Iraq is on the front page, and then the rest of the time it's not on the front page. Right? But it's important to remember that it used to be that was, you know, a bombing that killed 50 people. That was just called Wednesday. And then the same thing would happen on Thursday and Friday and Saturday and everything else. I would say, you know, as it relates to the attacks themselves, while they're extraordinarily tragic for the people who are affected and for the families that are affected, these acts of terrorism have I think it's important to emphasize, these acts of terrorism have repeatedly failed to accomplish Al-Qaeda in Iraq's primary objective, which is to spark a return to widespread insurgency and communal civil war. Look, their objective is not just to kill people. They can do that, although not as often and usually not in as deadly a fashion, right? But they can still do it. But their strategic objective is to make Iraq come off the rails, all right? To incite the type of tit-for-tat retributive cycle of communal violence that plunged the country into civil war in the 06-07 time period. And they have systematically failed in doing that, right? So you see a lot of resiliency built into the Iraqi environment. We like to say that the security progress is significantly improved but not yet enduring. And what we mean by that is it's been relatively enduring, but this is still a period where we have substantial numbers of U.S. forces to kind of back the Iraqis up. The real test will come, it's already starting to emerge, but it will come in the coming months and years as the Iraqis have to stand largely by themselves. What do I attribute this relative, you know, stability to? A couple things. The first thing to recognize is that Al-Qaeda in Iraq itself is weaker than ever. What was once a nationwide insurgent organization that had robust alliances with other Sunni militant groups is now increasingly an isolated terrorist group. There aren't parts of the country, swaths of the country, that Al-Qaeda owns. There used to be. There aren't. It's become much more difficult for the organization to communicate, to organize, to coordinate, to finance their activities. Right? And so we currently view Al-Qaeda in Iraq basically as a cellular terrorist organization that is capable of periodically marshaling their limited resources to do things, right? But is not currently capable of holding large chunks of territory or fundamentally destabilizing or overthrowing the Iraqi government, right? Which is a big change from where Al-Qaeda was in 2005, 2006. And a lot of that has been that we've really gotten after Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and by we, I mean we and the Iraqis, right? The op tempo of our counterterrorism activities remain very high. We've done a lot to damage the network. In the last 6 months or so, something like 34 out of Al-Qaeda's top 42 leaders in Iraq have either been killed or detained. Their finances have been strained. Their communications networks have been strained. So the organization is not dead. We shouldn't count them out, and we should expect that there will be attacks by them in the future. But they are not the organization they were a couple of years ago, and we do not judge that they currently represent a threat that the Iraqis should not be able to handle moving forward. The other threat that's plagued Iraq in recent years, of course, is the Shia militia threat. We also think that that threat has been diminished and transformed since the height of sectarian violence in 06 and 07. Though Muqtada al-Sadr, who is currently living in Iran, maintains a small armed wing called the Promise Day Brigade, he has disbanded the much larger Jaish al-Mahdi, the Mahdi Army. He disbanded that organization in the aftermath of successful offensives by the Iraqi government against the Jaish al-Mahdi in 2008. And the Sadrs have tried to focus most of their activities as of late into a combination of social activism and participation in the political process. In fact, if you've read anything about Iraq in the last couple of weeks, the big news story is that the Sadrs Trend, which are the politicians aligned with Muqtada al-Sadr that won about 40 seats in the new Council of Representatives, might be 39 seats, have recently thrown their lot behind Prime Minister Maliki's bid to repeat as Prime Minister, which is interesting given that the conflict in 2008, which forced the disbanding of the Jaish al-Mahdi militia, was Prime Minister Maliki going after the Sadrs. So, this is a sign of how quickly things can change. The primary, which brings me to the next point, which is the primary factor which has enabled our troop drawdown has actually been the growth and improvement of the Iraqi security forces themselves. It's important to remember that counterinsurgency campaigns are never won by foreign troops alone. They are ultimately won through the actions of legitimate host nation governments that enjoy the support of their people, and by indigenous security forces that are capable of both knowing and protecting the population better than foreign powers ever could. Since January of 2009, the Iraqi Security Forces, or ISF, have been in the lead on security operations, a role that they have more capably embraced with each passing month and have embraced throughout the drawdown of U.S. forces over the last year and a half. While the United States continues to provide the ISF vital support to include training, equipping, mentoring, advising, and sometimes providing critical technical enablers like intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, close air support, things like that, the Iraqis, there should be no confusion, the Iraqis are in charge, and they simply no longer need such large numbers of U.S. forces to help them keep the violence in check. In fact, the ISF, at the same time that al-Qaeda and insurgent groups have gone down in capability and membership and popular support, and the same is true on the Shia militancy side, the ISF has grown to be more than 660,000. All right? We've invested a lot of money in growing the Iraqi security forces, which is not only includes the Iraqi Army and Navy and Air Force, but also the National Police, which is now called the Federal Police, local police, counterterrorism forces, emergency response units, facilities protection services, et cetera. So while AQI, Sunni insurgents, and Shia militants are still capable, they are not, in our judgment, as capable as the Iraqi security forces. And as a result, we do not think that extremists currently represent a threat to the viability of the Iraqi state, and I think we're fairly confident that assessment will stay true as we continue our drawdown. All right? I think it's also telling that the Iraqi security forces have remained professional and independent of political pressure even during this extended period of government formation. Right? Remember, the last time we had a government formation that took 6 months, all right? Here, when things really started to take off in terms of violent levels. All right? Power vacuum, things came off the rails. Didn't have a capable Iraqi security forces. They weren't particularly numerous. They weren't particularly loyal to the state. They weren't particularly committed to staying on the battlefield. All of those things have changed. One of the things that our forces do now is spend most of their time hanging out in the headquarters of the Iraqi security forces, providing critical advice and enablers to those. So we actually have pretty good visibility as to the kind of modernization and professionalization of the Iraqi security forces, and we'll continue to be involved in training and equipping those security forces. So we have decent visibility on the Iraqi security forces, and it is by far the consensus of our commanders on the ground that the Iraqis are stepping up, and that it's impressive that even though there's a lot of political uncertainty in Baghdad, that in a country that's a history of coups, a history of the military siding with particular political factions, that you don't see evidence of that at the moment. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that we've had a very long government formation period, things have stayed in terms of security incidents relatively flat. You did see, by the way, a slight increase in the August timeframe, but then after Ramadan, the numbers came back down, and in fact, I think that the casualty numbers, which aren't reflected on this, but the casualty numbers for September of 2010 are the third lowest on record. So security situation has calmed back down a little bit. So we've talked about a bunch of factors contributing to the security environment being better, but I want to conclude in this section at least with maybe the most critical one, and that is that our drawdown has been enabled by the fact that a viable political process actually now exists as the enduring framework in which key questions of the distribution of power and resources in Iraq can be resolved. The vast majority of Iraq's political parties, factions, and communal groups, including many former militants, are now heavily invested in the political system. As Vice President Joe Biden likes to remark, politics has broken out in Iraq. It's often messy, as it is even in the most developed democracies. I don't know how many of you have gone to Glenn Beck rallies. But the Iraqi commitment to the political process, no matter how messy and heated the rhetoric, is real. Democracies are prone to heated rhetoric. Iraq is no exception. And we have certainly seen a lot of it in Iraq, both in the period immediately before their national election and during this period of government formation afterwards. But it's our view that as long as Iraqis stay committed to resolving their differences through the force of words rather than the force of bullets, Iraq is unlikely to sink back into widespread violence. So it's interesting that the Sadrists are competing to be inside the government as opposed to competing to overthrow the government. That's an important change. Okay? Which brings us to politics. General Odierno and now General Austin, who's our new commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, when they talk about security, they usually start with politics, actually, out of recognition that the remaining drivers of instability as such are largely political in nature. That is, Iraq settled into a much better place, although still a violent place that we hope will sometime improve. But if one can kind of imagine scenarios in which it gets a little worse or much worse, they largely come in the form of political disputes that linger. So to consolidate the progress, which is shown up here on the slide, we need to do a number of things. The most pressing thing at the moment is the formation of a government. I think that we saw a lull in Iraq, frankly, during the Ramadan period. Well, let me backtrack. For those of you who weren't, staying up late with the CNN political map on the day after the Iraqi elections and the weeks that followed when they tried to certify the elections, you may not know that there was basically a two-way tie. No party that ran in the elections won a majority. The two leading parties were separated by 2 seats. The Iraqiyya movement, which is kind of a combination of Sunni Arab groups and secular parties, and with some Shia membership, which was Ayad Alawi's party, got 91 seats, and then Prime Minister Maliki's party, the State of Law party, got 89 seats. Okay? And then you had some other parties that got in the range of 70 seats and 50 seats. And so because you basically had a tie, there was no natural equilibrium. Pile on top of that the fact that there's some personality clashes, there's residual distrust. The stakes are very high in Iraq, an oil-rich country that's prone to violence. And you put all these things together, and it's not surprising that it would take months. All right? So it has taken months. And the period of Ramadan slowed things down. As we've come out of the period of Ramadan, you've actually seen things speed up. And Muqtada al-Sadr's decision to, at least for the moment, for his party to back Prime Minister Maliki has actually kicked it up into another gear as other parties start to jockey and make their considerations about whether they're going to join that coalition or form alternative coalitions. So I'm happy to talk about kind of the state of play on government formation during the Q&A. Let me just say, for the record here, we're not playing favorites. All right? We're not. Our conversations. We are incredibly involved in the backroom conversations about government formation, but it's not about picking people or positions. Okay? It's about a set of principles and about a power sharing arrangement. How many of you have ever taken a political theory or philosophy class, maybe exposed to John Rawls? All right, I can say this as a political scientist who's now in the administration, right? Well, John Rawls had this notion, the veil of ignorance. You ever heard about that? It's not about putting a cloth over your head and acting stupid, okay? It's about, what if about making a series of decisions based on principles, not knowing what your status or position is, right? So in essence, if you want to have a just outcome, you should think about what would be a just outcome irrespective of, what job you would have or what position you would have or what class you would be in, all right? Well, while we never call it this, it's not in any official documents, our approach to government formation very much tracks with this general concept, which is trying to get agreement among the major players about what the foundational power sharing arrangement would look like. What are the core principles of the next government, and what set of institutional checks and balances on the various positions would be necessary so that no matter who the prime minister is, no matter who the president is, no matter who the speaker of the Council of Representatives are, right, the structures are in place and the agreements are in place to create kind of a foundation of trust so that that government can function. And with the idea being that once those core power sharing principles can be in place, right, then it takes a little of takes a little bit of the personality conflict and some of the personal distrust out of the next stage, which is to, you know, where the Iraqis will choose who's the prime minister, president, et cetera. Well, so for the most part, our government formation strategy is focused on these core principles, which our current ambassador in Iraq, Jim Jeffries, uses the acronym IRAQ. Inclusive, representative, accountable, and quick. A government that's inclusive of the major ethno-sectarian communities in Iraq. A government that is representative of the outcomes of the election, which means it's not just enough to have token Sunni membership in the government. We've really been pushing for Iraqia to have a prominent role in the government, reflective of the fact that it did very well in the elections. Accountable in the sense that there are individuals who are, you know, will be good at their jobs, able to provide services, provide security, work on building a long-term partnership with us, and quick in the sense of without undue delay. But the quick part is actually the least important part. It's more important that this government comes out the right way than it comes out quickly the wrong way. And by the way, the right way won't be determined by us, and it shouldn't be determined by us. The Iraqis are going to determine what the ultimate shape of their government looks like, but these principles, which we are defending and promoting, have the luxury of being principles that the vast majority of the Iraqi factions who are negotiating actually share. Right? They want an inclusive government, they want a representative government, they want an accountable government. So anyway, I'll shut up on government information for now. We can pick that up in the Q&A. The second political driver that we're trying to address is making sure that Iraq's Sunni population, which by and large has actually embraced the new political order and turned decisively against insurgent groups like Al-Qaeda, that we still address their remaining concerns to avoid kind of any lingering threat of violent recidivism. There will be such a threat as long as Sunni Arabs feel like they're not adequately represented or integrated. So on the government formation side, this is obviously informing in part our push to make sure that Iraqia is meaningfully included in the next government. But outside of the government formation process, this includes us continuing to push the Iraqi government to live up to its pledges to integrate the predominantly Sunni Sons of Iraq. The Sons of Iraq are composed of a number of individuals, many of which used to be former combatants, former insurgents, who we organized into kind of the equivalent of neighborhood watch organizations when the Sunni awakening occurred starting in late 2006 and accelerating in the summer of 2007. But a lot of these individuals desire to be employed in the government, either as part of the security services like the police or in civilian ministries. And the Iraqi government is committed to integrating 20% of them into the security forces and 80% of them into civilian agencies. And so it's us continuing to push with the Iraqi government to live up to that commitment. Finally, once we get past the government formation process, I expect that a major focus of our diplomacy over the next year or so will be on helping the Arabs and Kurds resolve their outstanding disputes. In fact, if you were to look at it, one series of political challenges that really could potentially pose a threat to the viability of Iraq, it's less the old school challenges and more the new school challenges along the Arab-Kurd fault line. And here, there's the status of various disputed internal boundary areas, the area between the Kurdistan regional government in the north and the rest of Iraq. There's a set of towns, villages, roads, and other areas that are disputed as to whether they should be part of the KRG or whether they should be part of the rest of Iraq. And obviously, the most high-profile disputed area being the city of Kirkuk, the oil-rich city of Kirkuk, which brings me to another issue, which is oil. The Kurds have a lot of oil up north. They don't have unlimited authorities to exploit that oil under current arrangements with the central government. They also want to make sure that they get their fair share of the oil revenue that comes from the rest of the country. And so there's a lot of disputes with the central government over oil and management and resource distribution. And then there's some underlying tensions between the Kurds and the central government over the nature of Iraqi federalism. So one of the major things that we've done, the long-term solution to these will be a political accommodation that's reached between the KRG and the central government in Baghdad, or the Kurdistan Regional Government and the central government. But in the interim, we see much of what our job is to help set the stage for such a political accommodation, but also prevent local miscalculations from dragging the two sides into a conflict that both recognize they shouldn't have and wouldn't serve their interests. And so one of the things that our military has been involved in over the past year are the so-called combined security mechanisms, which are a series of joint checkpoints, patrols, and coordination centers all along the disputed internal boundary area between the Kurdish North and the rest of Iraq, where we partner with Iraqi security forces and Peshmerga forces, that's the Kurdish security forces, to do joint patrols and joint checkpoints, et cetera, with the goal of preventing small incidents from rapidly escalating into a shooting match. And we've actually been fairly successful at that. And that's the combined security mechanisms are one of the things that our troops continue to be involved in their training and advising and assisting role up north. And in fact, our presence in general is heavily oriented towards the north for that reason. All right. So let me talk about that's kind of where we are. Let me talk to you about where we're going. We're kind of managing two transitions at the moment. One transition is from the United States to Iraq, and the other is within the United States. That is, not within the continental United States, but within U.S. government agencies, shifting responsibilities from the Defense Department, where I work, to the State Department and other civilian agencies. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we're doing. I mentioned a minute ago that Iraqi security forces have made a lot of great strides in recent years, but they do continue to require some external assistance and will probably for some time. It's for this reason that the U.S. Transitional Force, which is currently around 50,000, as I mentioned a minute ago, is organized around 6 advise and assistance brigades. Okay? So we no longer have brigade combat teams as such. We have advise and assist brigades, and this isn't just a rebranding exercise. Okay? These units are actually trained differently. They have some different mix of equipment, and they have some different personnel that's oriented around them having this advise and assist role. And so our AABs, these advise and assist brigades, will continue to train and support the Iraqi security forces, as well as to protect civilian agencies and occasionally do partnered counterterrorism operations. Moreover, one of the first things that we did when I came into office was to do a soup-to-nuts evaluation of the Iraqi security forces. All right? And what we concluded was that even though Iraq was spending a lot more on its military than it used to, and that they were spending a lot more on their military than we were spending on their military, and even though Iraq is potentially a very rich country, in fact, with oil contracts coming online, in the next 10 years, they could be exporting 6, 8, 10 million barrels a day, right, which would rival Saudi Arabia. Right? But they're not there yet. And that they had a gap in their resources, and that they couldn't fulfill with their own budget, and that they were spending most of their money simply sustaining the forces they had as opposed to growing forces and as opposed to buying the types of equipment and capabilities they were going to need as we left. All right? So we identified about $4.1 billion worth of requirements that we thought the Iraqis needed to provide for internal security, which is the highest priority as we draw down, and to lay the foundation for external defense, because Iraq lives in a dangerous neighborhood. All right? $4.1 billion in requirements over and above what the Iraqis were going to be able to spend themselves. Right? And then we said, well, let's ask Congress for $600 million of equipment transfer authorities so that we could take some of the equipment that U.S. forces would otherwise bring home or decommission and transfer that to the Iraqi security forces. Right? And then we said, and maybe we should ask the Iraqis to spend a little bit more, to squeeze out maybe another $500 million or so, and then that left $3 billion. And that was how much we asked Congress for in the FY10 supplemental and the FY11 budget. The Congress gave it the $1 billion in security forces funding for FY10. They have not yet given us the $2 billion, and there's some dispute as to whether they will, because the Senate's in one place and the House is in another, and we can talk about that if you want. But basically, we did this soup-to-nuts evaluation about what would be necessary and base our request to Congress on that assessment. All right? So one of the things we're trying to do is to get the Iraqi security forces in a good place by the end of 2011 in terms of internal security and foundation for external defense. Beyond 2011, right, we're standing up an Office of Security Cooperation in Iraq. I don't know if any of you have ever been to U.S. embassies around the world, but we have offices which are sometimes called Offices of Military Cooperation, Offices of Security Cooperation, Offices of Defense Cooperation in countries all over the world. Sometimes they're very small, sometimes they're bigger, but they all fall under the embassy. All right? And their role is to continue to help provide security assistance, continue to help countries manage their weapons buys, to provide them training, et cetera, help plan military exchanges, joint exercises, things like that. And while all of that probably sounds incredibly boring, it is actually the foundation through which we will be able to continue to assist the Iraqi security forces beyond 2011. Okay? Because at the end of 2011, under the current security agreement, U.S. forces are due to depart. But we will still have an Office of Security Cooperation that operates out of the U.S. Embassy and a number of satellite offices that helps the Iraqis from that point forward. At the same time that we're laying this foundation for a long-term security partnership with Iraq, we're doing a number of things to ramp up the U.S. civilian effort. We are going to have a very large civilian diplomatic presence in Iraq. We are going to have one of the largest embassies in the world in Baghdad. We will have two consulates, one up in Erbil in the KRG and one down south in Basra, which is kind of it's the largest southern city. It's the hub for the southern oil economy, a linchpin for the Iraqi economy for that reason. And then we will have two embassy branch offices, which are basically, you can think of them as kind of relatively temporary diplomatic outposts. One in Mosul, which is probably Iraq's most violent city, and the other in Kirkuk. And the argument being that this is where we need to be devoting our resources in terms of programmatic resources, but also in terms of conflict resolution resources, is along the Arab-Kurd fault line. So we've thought about that. The other thing the State Department's ramping up to do is to take over the police training mission. You know, the State Department had the police training mission in 2003. Because of challenges in the way they initially executed that mission, it was given to the Defense Department, right, which executed the mission in 2004 and beyond. Right? We now feel like we've gotten the police in pretty good shape as it relates to basic skills and basic equipment, and as U.S. forces depart, it's time to hand the mission back over to the State Department. And so the State Department is going to take on one of its largest police training missions in the world in Iraq. For those of you who don't kind of follow bureaucratic stuff in Washington, you may not realize that the State Department actually owns police training in the vast majority of countries. They have an organization called INL, and International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, I think, and that handles our police training mission. So part of this has also been planning, okay, how are we going to do police training with fewer people and not as much military presence to protect people, move them around, et cetera. And so, where are the hubs, where are the spokes, how often are the trainers going to be able to get out, how many of them are there going to be, what skill sets are they going to focus on, are they going to focus on high-end skills like forensics and things like that. So this has been a big area of deliberation in our efforts. But the ultimate goal in Iraq is to continue to move the Iraqis towards what we call police primacy. In much of the developing world, look, let me back up. In the United States and in most OECD countries, the role of the Army, Navy, Air Force, et cetera, is external defense. The role of police is internal defense. In many developing countries, okay, the Army is at least as internally focused as they are externally focused. Right? That is not a healthy arrangement for democracy. So if we hope to promote Iraqi democracy and the development of rule of law over time, as Iraq stabilizes, it's important to get their army out of the business of counterinsurgency and to move the Iraqi police into the role of providing internal security. So that's our long-term objective as it relates to that. All right, almost done. All of these activities are aimed at strengthening our engagement with a fully sovereign Iraq, even as our forces redeploy and the nature of our engagement evolves. The foundation of our long-term partnership with Iraq already exists in the form of the Strategic Framework Agreement, the SFA, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, which is a second compact that accompanied the signing of the security agreement in November of 2008. The SFA established mechanisms to deepen long-term diplomatic, cultural, economic, scientific, and security ties between us and Iraq. It also provides a vital platform to help our Iraqi partners become more fully integrated into the international community. As we approach the end of the security agreement, the SFA will actually take on increasing importance, and we look forward to working with the new Iraqi government, once we have a new Iraqi government, to fully energize the SFA's multiple avenues for cooperation. Why do we care? Well, we've invested probably $1 trillion in Iraq. 4,400 Americans have lost their lives. 34,000 Americans have been wounded. We've made a big investment in that country. And whatever one's views were of the war itself, the last president and this president disagreed, for example, about whether we should have gone in to begin with. We've spent a lot of blood and treasure in Iraq. Iraq is an important country. It was an important country long before we went to war there. It was an important country in 1991. It was an important country before that, during the Iran-Iraq War. And I think we have some obligation to those who have made sacrifices and to the amount of national treasure that we've invested to try to have an outcome that is consistent with our national interests. The United States and Iraq, I think, have a number of common concerns, both within Iraq and in the region, including counterterrorism, counterproliferation, maritime security, and air defense. These common interests, I think, underlie the shared U.S. and Iraqi commitment to regional peace and stability, Iraq's regional integration, and the free flow of commerce. Continued security assistance and cooperation through our Office of Security Cooperation will assist in addressing these common concerns that we have with Iraq. Continued U.S. support to the ISF, including joint training exercises and military exchanges, will also help to ensure steady improvements in Iraqi capabilities and allow them over time to shift from just internal defense to providing internal security as well. Iraq now has an opportunity, unique in its recent history, I think, to be a force for regional stability as opposed to instability. For decades, Iraq was a driver of instability in the Middle East. In the 1970s and 1980s, Iraq aggressively aspired towards regional hegemony. In the 1990s, Iraq invaded its weaker neighbor Kuwait, triggering a war and more than a decade of sanctions and isolation. The fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, whatever came after it, did correct one of those sources of instability, but it also unleashed a whole set of other sources of instability, both in Iraq and in the region. Now, with dramatic improvements in Iraq's security situation, its continued economic development, determined Iraqi efforts to consolidate the hard-fought gains through the political process, and continued U.S. engagement, it's our view that Iraq has a real opportunity to chart a new course, one in which a fully sovereign Iraq contributes to regional peace and prosperity in partnership with us and with the wider international community. This is something that we want. This is something the administration values highly. It's our judgment it's something that the vast majority of Iraqis want. And so the change of mission that we saw on September 1st was just the next milestone on the road to trying to build this longer-term strategic partnership. So with that, why don't I be quiet and let you ask the question, and I look forward to the discussion.
I wanted to ask you because some of your comments were reminiscent of the Bush administration, particularly your assignment of blame for the majority of actions on AQI rather than nationalists. And I was wondering how much of the SIG acts you've seen in the last 6 months or so have been related to the election and nationalist parties. I'm down here. Nationalist groups and their militias carrying out SIG acts, and how many are truly AQI, and what is the capacity of these nationalist groups to possibly cause a further spike should negotiations to form a government breakdown?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, historically, AQI was part of a constellation of insurgent groups. In fact, it was always a misnomer to call it an insurgency, because it was always insurgencies. Although there was a time, especially by 2006, where AQI had pride of place in that arrangement, especially with the stand-up of the Islamic State of Iraq and as an umbrella organization through which AQI worked with other, especially hardcore extremist groups like Ansar al-Sunnah and groups like that. In 2007, well, starting in late 2006, but through 2007, through the Sunni awakening, you saw a lot of the nationalist insurgent groups start to fragment. And you saw elements within the Islamic Army of Iraq, the 1920s Revolution Brigades, et cetera, start to break apart. And in fact, a lot of the Sons of Iraq emerged out of elements of nationalist Sunni insurgent groups. Fast forward to today. We do see some activity by nationalist groups. The most notable probably is JRTN, the Naqshbandi, up north. But at least in our counting, and maybe there are flaws in our methodology, but at least in our counting, it's still not as high as AQI and doesn't represent kind of daggers at the heart of Iraq, right? I mean, AQI keeps doing high-profile bombings in Baghdad and elsewhere in an effort to stoke sectarian violence. JRTN is, of course, and other nationalist groups continue to be very anti-American. But honestly, as we've continued to draw down in compliance with the security agreement, the wind's been taken out of their sails a little bit. They still have a lot of vitriol and venom that they aim at the Iraqi government, which I think they sometimes cast as being dominated by Iran and being predominantly Shia and therefore not representative of Sunni interests, et cetera. But what's interesting is that view is not so overwhelming within the Sunni Arab population as a whole to give them a lot of support. I think that there is a considerable amount of Sunni political buy-in at the moment to the process. There's grumbling, and folks would always like more, but we don't see a lot of evidence of large swaths of the Sunni population about to defect from the political process back to the insurgent groups. Now, what could happen? I think if we get a narrow government out of the government formation process that excludes the major Sunni parties, and especially that if it excludes Iraqiyya, that would be troubling. I think that it might cause some Sunni Arabs to judge that there's not a place for them in the new Iraq. But it's for that very reason that the vast majority of the Iraqi political class, to include the leadership of all the major Shia parties, don't want to exclude Iraqiyya. Right? The Sadrists are saying that. Amar Hakim and Adel Abdel Mehdi from the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq are saying that. To the degree that we can discern what the clerical establishment in Najaf is saying, they clearly are in favor of a national unity government that incorporates the Sunnis in a representative fashion. The Kurds are insisting on Iraqi being. So I think there's recognition, because there's recognition of the danger, that provides impetus towards the Iraqis themselves demanding inclusion, to include the Shia and Kurdish parties. So at the moment, I think that the Sunni nationalist insurgent threat lingers, but it's much diminished, doesn't have a lot of popular support, and as we continue the drawdown, even those elements that are there are going to be more and more going to have to choose between being completely marginalized or trying to join the political process. So, in the absence of a number of wild cards, most pressing one being the exclusion scenario, which I think is unlikely, we don't see a significant risk of them going up. Whoever, you're in charge, you get the mic. Except for that guy, don't give it to that guy. I know that guy.
Thank you very much. First, I want to congratulate you on your moving so smoothly from an academic position to a political position. You've mastered spin, clearly, in discussing this formation of an Iraqi government. You talked about, well, of course it's going to take a little bit of time. It happens in such situations, as opposed to saying this is the longest any country has ever gone after an election without forming a government, which would be a slightly different spin. And true. So, as you know, Secretary Kahl, I have always personally viewed this Iraq situation through the lens of ethnic rivalry and ethnic conflict. It's why, prior to the war, I wrote many, many articles saying, don't overthrow Saddam, because you'll have a horribly bloody ethnic civil war between Shiite Arabs, Sunni Arabs, and Kurds, which we then got. It's why in 2007 I wrote, try please to incorporate the Sunni forces into the government, then they will become loyal to the government and work against Al-Qaeda. And that seemed to work fairly well. And so my question is, today you seem to, again, maybe it's just spin, but you seem to be arguing, I think sincerely, that you believe that the ethnic rivalry has been largely put aside, damped down, in a way that you portray as sustainable. And I'm more skeptical for both general reasons and specific reasons about Iraq. First of all, as you know, most civil wars, ethnic civil wars that are settled, come back to life and start a new war within 5 years. That's when they're settled by agreement. This war wasn't even settled by agreement. It's really not over. That, you know, those security incidents are lower. That's still a lot of security incidents. In general, these sorts of wars revive, and specifically in Iraq, right? There is the issue of the Kurds in the north, the Kurds versus the Arabs. But in my opinion, there's still the issue of the Shiites versus the Sunni. And you say, well, but the Sunni have been incorporated, and all of the Shiite parties want to incorporate Iraqiyya in the government, which means incorporating the Sunnis. But there's a difference between nominally having a Sunni-type party in the government and fully accommodating Sunni concerns. And Sunni concerns are two, as every group in the world has two concerns: security and prosperity. Okay? And the question is, do the Sunnis feel, number one, they're going to get a fair share of the oil revenue, and number two, that they are going to be protected, not subject to predation by the security forces? All right? And so for many Sunni, logically, the metric is, are we being incorporated into the security forces? And the answer to this day is not at the level at which they expect, not at a fair level, not at a level at which they were promised. Okay? And if the Shiites promised to incorporate the Sunni into the security forces, the U.S. has begged the Shiites to incorporate the Sunnis into the security forces, and the Shiites still refuse to incorporate the Sunni into the security forces. Isn't that a really, really bad sign about the good faith of the Shiites to share power? And don't the Sunnis have a reason to be concerned? And doesn't that portend really bad things, actually, about Iraq's future?
So Alan and I go way back. So he was calling, by the way, Alan was calling me a sellout when I was still in academia. So I'm used to it, and I've got thick skin. That's actually the politest question that Alan has ever asked. Also one of the shorter presentations he's ever given. All right, a couple of things. Record government formation, totally, completely true. They've now surpassed, it was the Dutch, I think. You know, look, we expected it to be months. Did we expect it to be 6 or 7 months? I think 6 months was probably on the outer edge of what we expected, but we knew it was going to take months. I think we felt, and by the way, this was before the national elections. I think after the national elections, when it was basically a two-way tie and almost a three-way tie, because the INA got something like 71 seats, we knew this was going to take a long time. And because Maliki's coalition and Iraqiyya were so close, we spent 2 months-ish, you know, bickering about certification of results and dangling chads and all of that to figure out whether the results were actually results. So it took months. It took longer to certify the election. So the government formation process didn't even start right after the election. Okay, you had months of trying to certify the elections. Then you had Ramadan, which slowed things down, and so there was no natural equilibrium that came out of the elections. The elections took a long time to certify, and then you had Ramadan. So it's taken a long time. It's taken a long time. What's interesting is that the Iraqis themselves appear to have taken note of the fact that they've crossed this record, and it's not only the end of Ramadan and Eid which has picked up the pace. I think to some degree that this is not a record that they enjoy having. And I think what's interesting is I think there's a degree to which the Iraqi political class, dawning on the Iraqi political class, that it's becoming increasingly difficult for the government to try to accomplish some of its objectives the longer this takes. And these are common Iraqi objectives, things like passing budgets, building their partnership with us, which requires us to have a government we can speak to on these issues. And so we're pushing. We're pushing for Iraq, inclusive, representative, accountable, quick. And the quick part's picked up a bit. Are we there yet? I don't know. I think that there's a lot more momentum in the system than was the case a month ago. I think there's a couple of different scenarios that we could see emerging. I'd be happy to talk about that if people are interested. I think even once they figure out who the three top slots are, the Prime Minister, President, and House of Representatives Speaker, it's still going to be some time after that to establish the other ministers and deputy ministers. So we're not quite there yet. But here are three facts, not spin. The last time there was a government formation process, the country burned to the ground. It burned to the ground because Iraq's institutions weren't capable of keeping the lights turned on, providing services, providing security, et cetera. The caretaker government's doing a good job. Back then, the Iraqi security forces did not have a lot of trust among the Iraqi population. There were a lot of sectarian influences within the Iraqi security forces. We see public opinion now where the majority of the Iraqis continue to have faith in the Iraqi security forces, and where we've made actually a lot of strides in professionalizing. That's different, by the way, in terms of ethno-sectarian composition. I think a lot of times, Alan, and I think we can be prone to this as academics, we use ethno-sectarian labels and then we impute identities and interests based on those labels. I think that there are a lot of Iraqi nationalists in the Iraqi security forces. Some of them may go and worship in a Sunni mosque or a Shia mosque, or have family up in Kurdistan or down in Karbala, but at the end of the day consider themselves to be Iraqis and to consider themselves to be nationalists. And so I actually think that the role that the caretaker government has played and that the ISF has played in staying professional and neutral during this record-breaking period of government formation gives me confidence, not the lack of confidence, because if Iraq was really as fragile as we thought, we wouldn't have been able to pull out almost 50,000 American forces during the government formation period and have this political turbulence on the surface and have things not fall apart. All right? If Iraq was as fragile as you viewed, things would have already fallen apart, and it hasn't. So that gives me some solace. Now let's talk about some political science, about whether Iraq in the future, and based on research on civil and ethnic conflict, et cetera, there are a couple of things. The grievances haven't gone away, and I didn't assert it, nor would I assert it. They are being channeled, however, through the political process of ICE taking up arms. All right? There is, all right, a debate about the role of inclusive institutions and whether they end up siphoning off support for rebel groups. At the aggregate level, there's kind of mixed data on the relationship between democratization and state failure, civil conflict, things like that. But there actually is a fair amount of research in the comparative politics literature about institutional inclusivity in certain settings taking the oxygen out of insurgent organizations. Point number one. The second is that civil wars do end when the fundamental balance of forces changes. And I think what you saw in this period of the war is just that. Okay? A couple of things happened simultaneously. I think the Sunni population and Sunni insurgent groups recognized that they were losing and that they were likely to lose. I think that there was a mythology which they embraced during the 2003, 2004, 2005 period that ranged from everything like we're the actual demographic majority in Iraq to we have all the military expertise, so if it ever gets down to a knockdown, drag-out fight between us and the Shia militias, we'll win. Well, in 2006 and 2007, they didn't win. Okay? And at the same time, the Iraqi security forces, which used to be small, not all that coherent, not all that modern, have grown to be more than 660,000. And the bad guys got kicked in the teeth. They got kicked in the teeth by us. They got kicked in the teeth by Shia militia groups. And they fragmented. So the fundamental balance of forces has changed in a way which I think works against your notion that that you could flip a switch and they turn back on. Another political science notion. How many of you are collective action problems? All right. It was really hard to deactivate the Sunni insurgency because they were Sunni insurgencies. You didn't have one node. There wasn't a Ho Chi Minh to sit down, strike a deal with, and then he would tell the orders to the insurgents to stop fighting. Okay? There were literally dozens and dozens of groups, each of which had loosely affiliated local cells, et cetera. So to deactivate the Sunni insurgency in 2007, we literally had to strike hundreds of micro ceasefires. These were the deals that we struck with the Sons of Iraq and the Sunni tribes in Anbar and elsewhere. well, the same collective action problems that made it difficult to turn off the insurgency make it very difficult for the insurgency to turn back on en masse, especially when you combine it with this balance of forces point. Because small local grievances could bubble up into a local uprising or an uptick of violence, but the degree of coordination that would be required to actually turn the insurgency on en masse, we're not seeing. Nor do we think is all that likely, and if it does pop up in one area or not, we think the Iraqi security forces are more than capable of clamping down on it. So from a collective action standpoint, even if the grievances were still there with the same level of acuteness, I think the organizational and resource issues argue against it. Last point, actually 2 points. One is that we also know civil wars tend to end when there's a lot of conflict exhaustion, and in particular when there's conflict separation. And I think that we've seen in Baghdad the separation of Sunni and Shia neighborhoods, which has had some effect. And more diffusely, though, I think Iraqis are just sick of it. They're sick of fighting. And so if there's not a lot of popular support going back to the dark old days, people say, yeah, things are awful now, but they're so much better than they were in 2006 and 2007, and I don't want to go back to that. And if I care about keeping my business open, I don't want to join, the local merry men of Sunni insurgents and risk all of that. All right? Last point. We know that insurgencies tend to thrive when there's a lot of external support. There has never been a huge amount of external support for Sunni insurgents. There's been more on the Shia side, but I actually think, and on that piece of the equation, Iran's strategic calculations have basically changed, in my view. I think that Iran judged that in 2008 they overplayed their hands, and as a result, risked undermining their position in Iraq by causing the Iraqi government to push back against Shia militias that were in their camp in 2008. And so the Iranians have dialed back their long-term agenda in Iraq so that they are keeping the option open of having some elite groups that can periodically remind the Iraqi government that they're around, but not to the level of a mass movement in the way that the Jaish al-Mahdi militia represented in 2007 and 2008. So in the absence of spin, I will give you some facts and theory, which I think basically support my underlying proposition.
Over here. You mentioned him a little bit. What do you think the role of al-Sadr will be in the future whenever he gets back from Iran? From what I understand, he's going to have like a higher religious standing than he did before, and with the 1.5 million followers in Sadr City, he could potentially have a pretty important role. If you think that's overplayed, what do you think his role will be in the future? Thanks.
No, it's a great question, and honestly, the answer is I don't know. Sadr's always been kind of an enigma. You're right that he's studying in Qom in Iran. He's kind of on the fast track to be an Ayatollah. I don't know what that means in terms of number of credit hours that he's taking, or how far along he is in those studies. He's certainly on an accelerated path. By all accounts, Muqtada al-Sadr is he's. I don't mean this at all in a patronizing way, but that he's matured in a political sense and sees things a little differently, perhaps less erratically than was the case a couple of years ago. I think he is, committed to the vast majority of the Sadr trend, being involved in the political and cultural and social arena. There's some debate, I guess, as to whether Muqtada al-Sadr envisions kind of the Nasrallah Hezbollah model, right, of turning the Jaish al-Mahdi into a broad, a sweeping social movement that has a small elite militant wing, although Hezbollah's isn't that small. In any case, he may have ambitions in that direction. I think this is some of the ambivalence that you see. It's for this reason that you see some of the ambivalence in the back and forth on government information over the role of his party, because the question is, what role should a political party have that has a kind of military wing attached in it, right? Which is something that our ambassador talked about. Is that our unease is not about the Sadrist trend as a whole, although they're pretty anti-American. And so I think we feel like if the Sadrist trend had a dominant role in the next Iraqi government, it'd be pretty hard for us to move forward on a strategic partnership with a government that didn't want a strategic partnership. So we care in that context, but so do most Iraqis who want that partnership. It's more this kind of split personality between being kind of inside the system and also being outside the system with guns. And that I think as the Sadr Strin and Muqtada al-Sadr in particular, they're going to have to continue to resolve that tension over time. And if they really want to be part of the political system, they're going to have to finally abandon the trappings of violence that they continue to cling on to in some forms.
First of all, thanks for your visit. And just a quick point, there was another analyst that took a look at that same slide last year and was saying that it actually corresponded to ethnic cleansing within Iraq, not so much success on anything that the U.S. was doing. My question is actually about, if we're having a change in implementation in Iraq, why is it that we have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense talking about what is ostensibly a political issue? And why haven't we also seen a major shift in funding to Department of State, USAID? Why does DOD still have their arms into this? This should be, really, if we're talking about transformation, we should be seeing some significant shift in funds. None of that is happening. None of that is requested by Congress. So it seems a bit of a disconnect there, which kind of ties with the other gentleman's comments about how we might be having some spin or laying out the same arguments that the previous administration laid out. I'd also ask for your comments on the recent GAO report about the significant missteps and miscounting of federal funds and expenditures in Iraq, in particular DOD funds again, that were not appropriately accounted for, and projects that have not been completed. Thank you.
Okay, all good questions. Let me actually take the ethnic cleansing bit, which was more of, I think, a comment than a question, but I just want to correct a couple things here. This period did coincide with the highest period of sectarian cleansing in Iraq. You had a huge number of internally displaced people fleeing Baghdad, most notably, and also an increase in refugees. And this is when you largely saw Baghdad become segregated between the Shia neighborhoods to the east and an increasingly small number of Sunni neighborhoods, largely to the west, although there were pockets elsewhere, and very few mixed neighborhoods. I think, honestly, I think historians and political scientists and others who study conflict are going to have to go and try to sort out what the sources of the declining violence are. I think that there was a confluence of things coming together, to be honest. I think one of the things that changed the calculation was that there were more American forces. But even more important than that was a new strategy. And the new strategy a lot of times is talked about in terms of Petraeus' counterinsurgency strategy of protecting the population. That was part of it, but another big part of it was the decision by General Petraeus and General Odierno at the time, who was the Corps commander, to define 80% of those we were fighting against as reconcilable so we could cut deals with. And this goes back to some of the other things. So that included predominantly the Sunni groups, although not exclusively. So part of it was there were more of us, the shift to population protection, the fact that there were more of us partnered with the Iraqi security forces, the part that we were willing to strike these micro ceasefires with Sunni combatants, the fact that Sunni calculations changed along the lines of what I talked about earlier, the fact that they recognized that they were on the losing end of this, and as a result, factions within the Sunni insurgency effectively switched sides, deciding that we were their short-term protectors against both Shia militants and al-Qaeda in Iraq, who was increasingly targeting Sunni moderate groups that didn't agree with them. Right? And then there's, of course, this exhaustion and conflict separation argument, which I pointed to before. So I think all of this stuff was happening at the same time. And so the difficulty in kind of peeling back the onion of causality on this is that temporally it was all happening at the same time. So I am not convinced that it was the separation alone which did it, largely because you can see those areas in which potential flare-ups could happen now, and the Iraqi security forces and some of the other factors that I think were important in bringing it down continue to keep a lid on things. So, in any case, to be decided later. State. Well, one question, I thought you were saying, why isn't there a State Department person up here? And I was going to say, well, that's Frank's fault, because Frank doesn't have any friends in the State Department. But then that's not true, because Frank has, because Jim Steinberg is a close friend of Frank, so that doesn't explain it either. It's just that Frank invited me, so I'm talking. And in all seriousness, if you I've given this presentation a couple times around Washington, and this is actually the first time I've given the presentation without a State Department person next to me. Usually I go on the road with Michael Corbin, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq at the State Department. It's just, Michael's not an Austin City Limits fan, so he's come down with me. So, and in terms of putting our money where our mouth is, That's actually not an area where this administration I think is open to criticism. We've actually asked the Congress for a lot of money. The problem is the appetite for spending money, period, is going down. Spending money on Iraq is particularly tight. And for whatever reason, it's sometimes harder for us to get Congress to give money to the State Department than it is for them to give money to the Defense Department. So what's interesting is the amount of defense spending in Iraq is going to come down dramatically as we complete the drawdown. Okay, I mean, at the height of the war, we were spending $10 to $12 billion on military operations a month in Iraq. The amount of money we've asked for the State Department in FY11, I think it's between $3 and $4 billion, which is an unprecedented amount of money. Except that if you put it in the context of how much we were spending on the military at the height of the war, it's like a week. So we're asking Congress to give us a week's worth of money to help get us across the goal line by fully funding these civilian entities. So I really don't think it's on us in terms of not asking for enough money. We're asking for a lot of money for the State Department, and it's not just, we picked a number. $3 billion sounds good. There was a in-depth, multi-month study about what would be necessary for the police training mission, what would be necessary to stand up these consulates and embassy branch offices, what would be necessary to stand up an Office of Security Cooperation, all of these things which informed our budget requests, and now we're on the Hill trying to defend those budget requests. But it's a tight fiscal environment, and the appetite for spending any money in Iraq is lower than it used to be. But we're doing our best. As it relates to the GAO accounting, the specific findings of that study relate to a whole host of projects that I was not involved in and were way before I came in to office, so I'm not going to comment on any of that because I simply am not aware of the facts and I don't want to defend them one way or another. I will say that the DoD is out of the brick and mortar business. We don't do large infrastructure projects anymore in Iraq, and we don't even do very many small projects anymore in Iraq. And to the degree that there are criticisms about leaving projects unfinished in the past, I will tell you that in my recent trips to Iraq, a major point of emphasis among our commanders who continue to spend modest sums of Commander's Emergency Response Program money, CERP money, on local projects is start no project you can't finish by the end of 2011, and make sure your highest priority is completing the projects that are already underway. So that's all I can tell you on that.
This might be a can of worms, but every time I hear you talk about these issues, I kind of want to say, well, Colin, tell me about what your wise advice on Iraq might tell us about the prospects for success in Afghanistan. So,
first of all, I told you I only have the easy countries. I don't have Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I am not, nothing that I say should be viewed as official or on any of this. Not my area. But I think it's important to remember that there are lessons kind of at the theoretical level that can be learned from Iraq to Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is not Iraq. Okay? It's a very different society. It's a very different social makeup in terms of tribes, in terms of ethnic groups. Its history is very different. Its political economy is tremendously different. It's a predominantly rural country. The amounts of, illiteracy rates are not something that's a huge challenge in building up the Iraqi security forces. It is a huge challenge in building up the Afghan security forces. First, you have to teach them to read before you teach them to shoot. Okay? Another issue, if you stand up in Afghan national security forces of say 300,000, that might cost $4, $5, $6 billion a year to sustain. Well, but that's bigger than the entire Afghan budget. So in Iraq, which this year will spend $11 billion on its Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense, Afghanistan doesn't have that type of money, right? So these are all challenges on the Afghan side so literacy funding, things like that. What are the things that might translate? I think that the strategy which General Petraeus, General McChrystal, and that the administration signed off on has some similar elements. Okay, focusing on population security, focusing on more partnering with local security forces to accelerate their progression along the learning curve, try to set the stages for a transition to their security responsibility where it's possible, try to gain some momentum on the battlefield so that when and if there are political discussions that involve former combatants, that you do that from a position of strength as opposed to a position of weakness. So I think there are parallels, being open to having conversations, population security, a focus on local security forces, but in implementation, you know, Afghanistan's different from Iraq, and so I wouldn't be the right person to guess. I will say I've gone to Afghanistan twice with the Secretary. Sometimes when he goes to Iraq, he goes to Afghanistan, so I've gone along with him. And it was our strong sense when we were there first week of September that in small, hard to aggregate pieces, there appears to be some shifts on the ground. But whether that'll add up to enough progress or not, I don't know. I hope so.
Please join me in thanking Colin Kahl for such a terrific